An ancient secret lies hidden in the depths of the Judean desert. A name that has defied history and scholars for centuries, Pinhas. In the folds of these ancient scrolls, Hebrew letters reveal enigmas. Pinhas, he is one of the most mysterious figures in the Bible. Prepare to discover what time has tried to erase.
Shalom, shalom, and welcome to your channel, Mishnah TV. As we do every week, today we set out to study the asterisk parasha of Pinhas, one of the most controversial portions of the entire Torah, especially when viewed through the lens of our postmodern era. Now, imagine for a moment a scene that would dominate international headlines for weeks today. A religious leader witnesses conduct he considers a public affront to God, taking place right before the entire community. He calls no meeting, he consults no tribunal, he waits for no vote, he drafts no press release. He acts immediately. And as a result of that violent act, God grants him a covenant of peace. The question is inevitable. How can an action that seems so extreme end up receiving divine approval? And an even more uncomfortable question, if something similar were to happen today, would we consider it an act of holiness or an act of fanaticism? Welcome to one of the most controversial stories in the entire Torah. The parasha of Pinhas is not a simple tale of heroes and villains. It is a theological, ethical, and philosophical minefield that has divided commentators, rabbis, thinkers, and scholars for centuries. For behind Pinhas's famous action lies a question far deeper than the story itself. What happens when God's honor appears to be publicly humiliated? And more importantly, who has the right to decide that this is happening? We live in an age where almost everyone feels authorized to speak on behalf of truth, morality, justice, or even God. Yet the Torah compels us to ask a troubling question. Is there a line separating sacred zeal from religious extremism? Jewish tradition calls this issue asterisk Hilul Hashem, the profanation of the divine name. It is a concept so serious that the sages considered it one of the gravest transgressions in Judaism. Yet defining what truly constitutes a profanation of God's name has proven to be an extraordinarily complex task. And here the paradox emerges. The figure of Pinhas has been admired by some as a defender of holiness, while viewed by others with deep caution. The Talmud debates his conduct. Medieval commentators attempt to define its boundaries. Kabbalah uncovers hidden meanings within it. Modern scholars analyze it as a borderline case involving religious authority, violence, and moral legitimacy. Nothing in this story is as simple as it seems. Throughout this lesson, we will explore why the Torah portion of Pinhas became a foundational text for understanding asterisk Hilul Hashem, the desecration of God's name, how it has been interpreted over more than 3,000 years, and why the questions it raises remain just as uncomfortable today as they were in the wilderness of Moab. For perhaps the real issue is not what Pinhas did. Perhaps the most dangerous question is who, in every generation, believes themselves to be Pinhas. This is Abel Flores, journalist and founding researcher of Mishnah TV. Thank you very much for studying with us. Please remember to subscribe to our channel, give us a like, and visit our website, lamishna.com, where you will find our course on the Mishnah in your language. Before we can understand why the story of Pinhas sparks so much debate, we must consider a fundamental concept in Jewish thought, a concept that, while seemingly simple, holds profound spiritual and ethical depth: Hilul Hashem. The Hebrew expression asterisk Hilul Hashem derives from the root halal. This is a fascinating root because it does not merely mean to profane. It can also signify to empty, to hollow out, or to desacralize. Here we encounter a remarkable initial insight. When the Torah speaks of profaning God's name, it does not imply that a person can actually harm God. That is impossible. God cannot be diminished by human action. What can't happen, however, is that people strip the divine presence in the world of its meaning. In other words, Hilul Hashem occurs when human behavior causes others to lose respect for the Torah, for spiritual values, or for the image of God that those values represent. Thus, simply put, Hilul Hashem is any action that publicly diminishes God's honor or discredits his Torah in the eyes of others. Note the key word, publicly. For in rabbinic thought, we are not speaking merely of individual sin. We are discussing the impact our actions have on those who observe us. A teacher may impart values for decades, yet a single contradictory action can destroy in minutes the credibility built up over years. Jewish tradition grasped this principle long before the advent of social media. Today, we might call it a loss of trust, reputational damage, or a credibility crisis. The Torah calls it Hilul Hashem. Yet, every concept requires its counterpart. The opposite of *Hilul Hashem is *Kadush Hashem, the sanctification of the divine name. If *Hilul Hashem consists of obscuring God's presence in the world, Kadush Hashem consists of making it visible. Every act of honesty, justice, compassion, or integrity has the power to elevate how others perceive divine values. For this reason, in Judaism, holiness is not limited to the temple, the synagogue, or prayer. It also manifests in business, in the family, in our speech, in how we treat others, and especially in situations where no one expects us to act rightly. The primary source of this teaching is found in the book of Leviticus, where God declares, "And you shall not profane my holy name, but I shall be sanctified among the children of Israel." These words establish a constant tension that has accompanied Jewish life from ancient times to the present day. According to tradition, every person lives constantly between two possibilities, Kiddush Hashem or Chilul Hashem, sanctifying or profaning, drawing others toward the values of the Torah or driving them away. And here, an idea arises that may be uncomfortable. Often, it is not theology that convinces people of God's existence. It is the behavior of those who claim to believe in him. That is why the sages taught that every human action, however small it may seem, holds a dimension far greater than we imagine. For in every daily decision, in every word, and in every public act, we represent more than just our own convictions. We are also defining, for those who observe us, the image they will form of God. To grasp the magnitude of what Pinhas is about to do, we must first understand the gravity of the crisis Israel was facing. And this is where the story becomes far more complex than it is usually portrayed. Many people remember this episode simply as a case of sexual immorality. Yet both the Torah and rabbinic tradition insist that the true issue ran much deeper. The crisis begins at the end of the previous Torah portion, as the people of Israel are encamped on the plains of Moab, at the very threshold of the Promised Land. After 40 years in the wilderness, their goal is practically within reach. Yet at that very moment, one of the most severe spiritual lapses of the entire Exodus generation occurs. The biblical text recounts that numerous Israelites engaged in acts of sexual immorality and were drawn into the worship of Baal Peor, a Moabite deity associated with particularly degrading idolatrous rituals. It was not merely a matter of abandoning certain religious norms. It was about replacing loyalty to the God of Israel with an entirely different spiritual system. And, as often happens in human history, idolatry did not arrive in isolation. It came accompanied by seduction, social pressure, political interests, and a progressive erosion of moral boundaries. The central figure in this crisis is Zimri ben Salu, a prominent leader of the tribe of Simeon. And here, something occurs that transforms a private sin into a public event. Zimri is involved with Cozbi bat Tzur, a high-ranking Midianite woman, yet he makes no attempt to conceal the relationship. Quite the opposite, he flaunts it publicly. Rabbinic tradition describes the scene as an open challenge to Moses' authority. Picture the context. The people are suffering through a devastating plague. The leaders are gathered, seeking a solution. The nation is in the throes of an unprecedented spiritual crisis. And amidst this scenario, one of Israel's most prominent leaders appears, committing an act that openly contradicts the norms Moses had taught for decades. According to the Talmud, the core issue was not merely the relationship between Zimri and Cozbi. The issue was the message. It was a public declaration of defiance. It was a way of saying, I do not recognize the authority of the Torah. I do not recognize the authority of Moses. I do not accept the boundaries God has established. That is why the sages interpret this episode as far more than a personal transgression. They view it as a symbolic rebellion against Israel's entire spiritual system. And here we find a lesson that remains extraordinarily relevant today. Societies rarely disintegrate due to private errors. Deep crises begin when transgression turns into a banner, when disobedience becomes a spectacle, and when rebellion seeks public legitimacy. That is precisely the point where the story of Zimri ceases to be an individual matter. It becomes a paradigmatic case of *Hilul Hashem, the desecration of God's name. For we are no longer speaking of a personal failing. We are speaking of an act deliberately displayed to discredit religious authority, humiliate spiritual leadership, and normalize the breaking of the covenant that defined Israel's identity. And it is at that exact moment, when no one else seems capable of halting the crisis, that Pinhas appears. And the question that will run through our entire lesson is this: was his intervention a legitimate defense of holiness, or the start of a dangerous precedent regarding who may act in God's name? And now we arrive at one of the most fascinating, difficult, and at the same time controversial points in the entire Jewish tradition. For up to this moment, we have seen the crisis, we have seen Zimri's conduct, and we have seen Phinehas's reaction. But we have not yet answered the most important question: was what he did legal? The rabbinic answer is so surprising that it has baffled generations of students. The Mishnah, and subsequently the Talmud, develop a truly extraordinary legal category. The formula appears in Hebrew, brief and forceful. Haboel aramit kanaim pogimbo. He who has relations with a pagan woman, zealots may strike him down. The source is found in the Mishnah, Tractate Sanhedrin, chapter 9, Mishnah 6, and is discussed at length in the Babylonian Talmud, Sanhedrin 81b, 82a. Now, listen closely, because here we encounter one of the most extraordinary paradoxes in all of Halakha. After presenting this rule, the Talmud itself immediately adds a phrase that seems to neutralize everything it has just stated. In Hebrew, Halacha ve'ein morin ken. Literally, the law exists, but it is not taught. It is one of the strangest expressions in all of rabbinic literature. Imagine a law school where the professor were to say, yes, this rule exists legally, but we will never teach it to anyone as a model of conduct. It sounds contradictory, and that is precisely why it is so important. The sages understood that a rule of this nature could become extremely dangerous. For the exceptional story of Pinhas is one thing, but allowing just anyone to consider themselves authorized to act violently in the name of God is something else entirely. That is why the rabbis established extraordinarily strict limits. The rule could not be institutionalized. It could not be transformed into public policy. It could not become a judicial tool. It could not be enforced through the courts. It could not be taught as a standard procedure. In other words, the rabbinic tradition did its utmost to prevent the case of Pinhas from becoming a license for religious fanaticism. And here we find something deeply revealing about the mindset of the sages. While many cultures glorify exceptional heroic acts, rabbinic Judaism tends to view them with suspicion, for it knows that exceptions can be imitated by people who lack the wisdom, purity of intention, or the specific circumstances that made the original case possible. The rabbis seem to ask themselves, what would happen if every individual decided for themselves when God's honor was being offended? What would happen if every person believed themselves to be a new Pinhas? The answer is unsettling. The result would be chaos. That is why halacha creates a unique kind of legal paradox. It acknowledges the exceptional legitimacy of what occurred, yet at the same time, it erects barriers to prevent its repetition. And here arises the first great controversy that has accompanied this story throughout nearly 2,000 years of rabbinic debate. If Phinehas' action was right, if God approved of it, if he even received a divine reward for it, then why does Jewish law devote so much effort to preventing anyone from imitating it? Perhaps because the true message of the story is not that anyone can act in God's name. Perhaps the message is exactly the opposite, that genuinely exceptional cases are so dangerous that the tradition preferred to surround them with warnings rather than turn them into examples for the masses. And that tension between admiring Phinehas and at the same time preventing more figures like him from emerging is one of the fundamental keys to understanding this entire parasha. And now we arrive at the heart of the controversy, for after everything we have seen, one might think the story is already resolved. Zimri publicly challenges the authority of the Torah. Phinehas intervenes, the plague ceases, and God rewards his action. Case closed. But it is precisely here that the real problem begins. The Torah declares that God grants Phinehas two extraordinary rewards. The first is the asterisk Brit Shalom, the covenant of peace. The second is the perpetual priesthood for him and his descendants. And if we pause for a moment, a surprising paradox emerges. A man commits a violent act and receives peace as his reward. How can such a thing be understood? Does it not seem like a contradiction? The sages recognized this very tension long ago, and that is why, even though the Torah presents the divine reward, rabbinic literature never treats Phinehas as a simple or unquestionable figure. Quite the opposite. Many midrashim reveal a deep unease surrounding his figure. The sages recount that various tribes began to question his legitimacy. They did not merely dispute what he had done, they questioned who he was to do it. According to these traditions, some claimed Phinehas acted impulsively, others insinuated that he was driven by anger, and others saw him as dangerously close to fanaticism. It is an extraordinarily honest observation, for the rabbis could have transformed Phinehas into a perfect hero, devoid of nuance or questioning, but they did not. They preferred to preserve the complexity of the narrative. They preferred to keep the question alive. And that question continues to resonate to this day. Does the defense of divine honor justify extreme acts? It is a far more universal issue than it appears. Throughout history, countless people have claimed to act in the name of sacred causes. Some did so to uphold justice, others to defend moral principles, and others to justify acts that ultimately caused suffering and destruction. That is why the story of Phinehas has never been merely an ancient tale. It serves as a perpetual warning regarding the relationship between conviction and power, between faith and action, between spiritual zeal and violence. Jewish tradition grasped a profound truth. Not all religious fervor is holy. Not all spiritual passion is legitimate. And not everyone who claims to act on God's behalf truly does so. That is why the sages examine the figure of Phinehas with such caution, not because they reject his actions, but because they understand the immense danger that arises when human beings believe they perfectly represent the divine will. And here, another fascinating dimension of the asterisk Brit Shalom, the covenant of peace, emerges. Many commentators suggest that God grants him a covenant of peace precisely because violence, even when pursued for a noble end, leaves a mark on the one who commits it. As if the Torah were teaching that Phinehas needed peace after having endured an extreme situation. As if the reward were not merely a prize, but also an act of repair, a restoration, a way to restore balance to a world shaken by a moral and spiritual crisis. And perhaps that is the great lesson of this episode. The Torah acknowledges that there are exceptional moments in history, yet rabbinic tradition insists that such moments must never become a celebration of violence. That is why the figure of Pinhas remains deliberately unsettling, because his story compels us to ask a question that every generation must answer for itself. When are we defending the truth, and when are we nearly justifying our own excesses in its name? Now, after analyzing the story of Pinhas, the Talmudic debates, and the complex questions surrounding religious zeal, we need to take the next step. For until now, we have spoken primarily of extreme cases. But what exactly is Hilul Hashem? How is it precisely defined? And here, one of the most brilliant minds in Jewish history enters the picture. Rambam, Maimonides, philosopher, physician, jurist, and one of the greatest systematizers of rabbinic thought. While the sages of the Talmud left behind a multitude of scattered perspectives, Maimonides sought to organize them into a clear, coherent structure. And when he addresses the subject of Hilul Hashem in his Mishneh Torah, he does something truly extraordinary. He does not offer a single definition. He presents 3 distinct levels of the desecration of the divine name. And as we move through them, we discover something surprising. Each level is more challenging than the last. The first seems relatively straightforward. Maimonides teaches that a Hilul Hashem occurs when a person transgresses certain commandments under circumstances where their conduct publicly undermines the sanctification of the divine. We are speaking of situations involving coercion or religious persecution, where publicly renouncing fundamental principles can send a devastating message to the community. Here, the focus is on the public nature of the act, not merely on the action itself. The second level is even more direct. A Hilul Hashem occurs when a person sins deliberately. That is, when they act consciously against the divine will, not out of ignorance, not by accident, not by mistake, but with full awareness of the transgression. Up to this point, it all seems quite logical. But then we reach the third level, and here Maimonides completely changes the rules of the game. According to him, even conduct that is technically permissible can constitute a Hilul Hashem. Let us pause for a moment, because this idea is revolutionary. We are not talking about idolatry. We are not talking about immorality. We are not talking about a crime. We are talking about something permitted, and yet it can become a desecration of the divine name. How is that possible? Maimonides answers that when a respected person, a sage, a leader, or someone publicly identified with the Torah, behaves in a vulgar, arrogant, or dishonest manner, or acts in a way unworthy of their position, they cause immense spiritual harm. For people do not merely observe their words, they observe their example. And here, a deeply human truth emerges. Most people judge a teaching by the behavior of those who represent it. If a teacher preaches integrity but acts with pettiness, people do not simply conclude that the teacher is inconsistent. Often, they conclude that the teaching itself lacks value. That is why Maimonides asserts that the public degradation of the Torah can occur even when no formal transgression has taken place. Let us consider a contemporary example. A religious leader might observe every technical requirement of the law, but if he is arrogant, humiliates others, treats people with contempt, or behaves vulgarly, he inevitably raises a question in the minds of those observing him. If this represents the Torah, what value does the Torah have? And that is precisely where Hilul Hashem, the desecration of the divine name, arises. Not in the legal infraction, but in the damage caused to the public perception of divine values. That is why Maimonides' definition is so demanding, because it teaches us that holiness is not measured solely by what we do when facing great trials. It is also measured by our daily conduct, by the way we speak, by the way we treat others, and by the image of God we project when no one is evaluating us against a legal code, yet everyone is observing us as human beings. In Maimonides' view, the greatest Kiddush Hashem, the sanctification of the divine name, does not consist merely of defending God with words. It consists of living in such a way that others can perceive the nobility of the Torah reflected in our behavior.
An ancient secret lies hidden in the depths of the Judean desert. A name that has defied history and scholars for centuries, Pinhas. In the folds of these ancient scrolls, Hebrew letters reveal enigmas. Pinhas, he is one of the most mysterious figures in the Bible. Prepare to discover what time has tried to erase.
Thus far, we have analyzed the concept of *Hilul Hashem from legal, ethical, and philosophical perspectives. We have seen how the Torah, the Talmud, and Maimonides understand the profanation of the divine name as a phenomenon affecting the relationship between God, the community, and human conduct. But Kabbalah invites us to look even deeper. It tells us that the problem is not limited to what occurs in society. It is not limited to the reputation of the Torah. It is not even limited to visible human behavior. According to the Zohar, the central work of the Kabbalistic tradition, every action performed by a human being produces effects that transcend the physical world. Human actions generate spiritual movements that reach invisible dimensions of reality. Therefore, for Kabbalah, Hilul Hashem is not merely a moral crisis. It is a metaphysical rupture. What does this mean? It means that the universe is not divided into a material world on one side and a spiritual world on the other. The two are connected. The visible and the invisible are part of the same structure. The lower world reflects the upper world, and the upper world constantly influences the lower world. When a person acts with justice, compassion, and fidelity to the divine will, they strengthen that connection. But when they act against it, they create a separation, a fracture, a kind of spiritual short circuit. That is why Kabbalists describe *Hilul Hashem as a rupture in the harmony between the worlds, as if the invisible fabric binding creation together had developed a tear. And here we return once again to Pinhas, for the Kabbalistic reading of his story is as profound as it is unsettling. The Torah states that God grants him a Brit Shalom, a covenant of peace. Yet in the traditional Torah scroll, there is an extraordinary detail. The letter *Vav, Vav, within the word Shalom, appears written in an unusual way. It is split. It is broken. It is one of the most famous letters in the entire Masoretic tradition. And the Kabbalists ask themselves, why does the word peace specifically contain a broken letter? The answer is fascinating, because the story of Pinhas reveals a spiritual paradox. Holiness was defended, the plague was halted, the people were saved, yet a wound remained. The action served a necessary purpose within the biblical narrative. However, the violence used to achieve that purpose left a mark on the spiritual fabric of the world. The broken *Vav* thus becomes a powerful symbol. It represents a peace that exists, yet is incomplete. A peace restored, but one that preserves the memory of the fracture. A peace achieved after a crisis that left scars. And here we find an extraordinarily profound teaching from Kabbalah. Even when a cause is just, even when a battle seems necessary, even when holiness is defended, violence is never completely neutral. It always leaves a trace. It always creates a rupture that subsequently requires repair. That is why the true spiritual ideal is not simply to overcome evil. It is to restore unity, to rebuild connection, to heal the visible and invisible fractures that separate human beings from one another, and separate the world from its source. The broken *Vav* in Shalom reminds us that some victories come at a cost, and that authentic redemption does not arrive when we defeat our adversaries. It arrives when we manage to repair the ruptures that made the confrontation necessary in the first place. Perhaps that is why the Torah does not remember Pinhas solely for his zeal. It remembers him through a single word, shalom. Because the ultimate goal of holiness is never confrontation. The ultimate goal is always the peace that restores the wholeness of the world. After exploring the biblical, rabbinic, philosophical, and Kabbalistic interpretations of Pinhas, we arrive at an inevitable question. how do modern researchers read this story? For while the sages asked what this episode teaches us about God, the Torah, and holiness, many contemporary scholars pose a different question. What does this story reveal to us about human societies? And here, a fascinating journey begins. Modern studies do not usually focus solely on the religious dimension of the narrative. They also analyze its social, political, and cultural implications. One of the most influential approaches comes from the sociology of identity and from anthropology. According to this reading, the story's central issue is not primarily sexual. It is a matter of identity. It is a crisis of cultural boundaries. Let us consider the historical context for a moment. Israel stands at the threshold of the Promised Land. It is still a nation in the making. Its collective identity is still fragile. In this scenario, the union between Zimri and Cozbi does not appear merely as a relationship between two individuals. It transforms into a symbol. It represents the risk of cultural and religious assimilation. From this perspective, the primary concern is not the private conduct of a couple. It is the potential disappearance of a nascent national identity. In other words, some researchers argue that the story reflects a community's fear of losing what makes it unique. And if we are honest, this is not a concern exclusive to antiquity. Many cultures, peoples, and religions continue to face the exact same question. How can one preserve a distinct identity without isolating oneself from the world? But there is a second, equally fascinating reading: political theory. Some scholars view Pinhas as the emergence of a figure we might call an agent of charismatic authority, someone who acts outside established institutions, claiming to represent a higher authority. Let us note something important. Pinhas receives no explicit order from Moses. He does not act as a judge. He is not part of a tribunal. He does not consult a legal process. He acts on his own initiative. And precisely because of this, a deeply political question arises. Who controls the person who claims to act in God's name? It is a question that runs through all of human history. For when a person asserts an authority superior to institutions, normal oversight mechanisms begin to weaken, and then a problem emerges that remains relevant to this day. Where does legitimate conviction end, and where does the danger of unchecked power begin? Finally, we encounter a third approach that has been widely studied in academia: studies on religious violence. Many researchers consider the episode of Pinhas to be one of the foundational texts for analyzing phenomena such as religious extremism, sacralized violence, and the theological legitimation of force. And here, it is important to understand something. This does not mean that all scholars interpret Pinhas in the same way. It means that the narrative raises questions that constantly resurface in different historical contexts. What happens when a sacred cause justifies the use of force? How do societies distinguish between religious zeal and fanaticism? Can a deep spiritual conviction coexist with clear ethical boundaries? Precisely because of the depth of these questions, the figure of Pinhas has been compared to contemporary phenomena that are vastly different from one another. Not because they are all equivalent, but because they all force us to confront the same fundamental dilemma. What happens when an individual considers themselves responsible for defending an absolute truth? And perhaps that is the reason why this story continues to fascinate believers, rabbis, philosophers, and scholars more than 3,000 years later. Because at its core, the asterisk parasha of Pinhas speaks not only of a man, a crisis, or a historical moment. It speaks of a question that remains open. Who has the authority to act in the name of the sacred? And once someone claims that authority, who has the authority to stop them? And now we come to one of the most surprising aspects of the entire story of Pinhas, a detail that often goes unnoticed, yet reveals something profound about the soul of Rabbinic Judaism. For after everything we have studied, one might expect Pinhas to become the great model of religious heroism. After all, the Torah states that God rewards him. He receives a brit shalom, a covenant of peace. He receives the perpetual priesthood. The plague is halted. The nation is saved. If we were to look only at those elements, It would seem logical for later generations to teach, act like Pinhas. Yet exactly the opposite occurred. And here we encounter one of the great taboos of the rabbinic tradition. Although Pinhas is honored, his conduct is almost never promoted as a model to be emulated. In fact, the more rabbinic Judaism developed, the further it moved away from the idea that isolated individuals could act on their own initiative in God's name. This was no accident. It was a conscious decision. The rabbis understood that a civilization cannot be built upon exceptional acts. Societies need rules, they need procedures, they need institutions. That is why, instead of placing Pinhas at the center of Jewish life, they shifted the focus toward something entirely different, toward the courts, toward deliberation, toward legal debate, toward institutional mechanisms. Instead of glorifying immediate reaction, they exalted discussion. Instead of celebrating impulsiveness, they promoted analysis. Instead of relying on charismatic individuals, they strengthened collective decision-making structures. And this represents a genuine intellectual revolution. Let us consider the Talmud for a moment. Thousands upon thousands of pages where the sages discuss, question, argue, and argue again. Sometimes it takes generations for a decision to crystallize. Why such slowness? Why so much debate? Because the rabbis were deeply wary of absolute certainties concentrated in a single person. They understood something that human history has demonstrated time and again. Danger arises when someone claims to possess the whole truth. That is why Rabbinic Judaism built a culture where even minority opinions were recorded and preserved, where disagreements were studied, where important decisions underwent collective processes. And here emerges the implicit message that runs through the entire subsequent tradition. Pinhas's experience was exceptional, not normative. Exceptional means it occurred under extraordinary circumstances. Normative would imply it ought to be repeated regularly, and the rabbis strove precisely to avoid that conclusion. It is as if they were telling us, yes, the Torah recounts this episode. Yes, God rewards Pinhas. But do not build a society based on exceptional moments. Build a society based on justice, deliberation, and shared responsibility. In fact, one of Rabbinic Judaism's great contributions to the history of ideas was precisely this conviction. Divine will is not discovered solely through fervor. It is also discovered through dialogue, through study, through honest discussion, through institutions capable of limiting individual power. And perhaps that is why the figure of Pinhas remains so isolated within the tradition. Not because he was forgotten, but because the sages wanted us to remember something even more important. Exceptions may save a generation, but it is just institutions that sustain a civilization. And that distinction between the exceptional and the normative constitutes one of the profoundest lessons the rabbinic tradition drew from this entire story. Up to this point, we have studied Pinhas as a biblical figure, an ancient personage enmeshed in theological, legal, and philosophical debates. Yet it would be a mistake to think that these questions belong solely to the past, for the debate over who may act in God's name did not end in the wilderness of Moab. It remains alive, and rarely has it resurfaced as dramatically as it did on November 4th, 1995. That was the day Yitzhak Rabin, Prime Minister of Israel, and one of the most influential figures in contemporary Israeli politics, was assassinated. The assassination shocked the nation and precipitated a profound national crisis. But what made the event even more shocking was the justification offered by the assassin. Yigal Amir claimed he was acting based on religious arguments. In his view, Rabin was endangering Jewish lives through the Oslo Accords, the political process aimed at finding a negotiated solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Amir sought to ground his actions in traditional halakhic categories. And here, the very question we have been analyzing throughout this class resurfaces. Can a person decide for themselves that they are upholding the divine will? Can someone arrogate to themselves the authority to act outside established institutions because they believe they possess a higher truth? The response from the rabbinic world was extraordinarily clear, and this is a point worth emphasizing. The vast majority of rabbinic authorities categorically rejected any attempt to justify the assassination. Political differences might have been vast. Opinions regarding the Oslo Accords might have varied widely. Yet on this specific point, there was a near unanimous consensus. No individual has the authority to mete out punishment on their own initiative. No citizen may set themselves up as judge, jury, and executioner. No personal interpretation of halakha sanctions political assassination. Furthermore, they pointed to something even more profound. The state possesses legal institutions. There are courts, there are decision-making mechanisms, there are legitimate procedures for resolving political and legal disputes. Precisely for this reason, acting violently outside the framework of those institutions constitutes a denial of the fundamental principles of the social order. But many rabbis went even further. They argued that using God's name to justify a homicide does not represent a sanctification of the divine. It represents the exact opposite. It represents a Hilul Hashem, a desecration of God's name, of enormous proportions. Why? Because when a person commits murder while claiming to act under a religious mandate, they do not merely destroy a human life. They also damage the public image of the Torah. They damage the perception of religious values. They damage trust in the very tradition they claim to represent. Let us recall Maimonides' definition. A halal Hashem occurs when one's conduct causes others to associate the Torah with morally degrading behavior. From that perspective, many rabbinic leaders maintained that the assassination of Rabin produced precisely that effect. It was not viewed as a Kiddush Hashem, a sanctification of God's name. It was not considered a defense of divine honor. It was interpreted as a national and international halal Hashem, an event that projected a deeply distorted image of the Jewish tradition to the world. And here we find an extraordinarily important lesson for understanding the entire story of Pinhas. For centuries, the sages insisted that the experience of Pinhas was exceptional and not normative. They insisted that no one should turn that episode into a license to act unilaterally in God's name. The Rabin case demonstrated in a painful way why the rabbis were so cautious. Because when a person arrogates to themselves an authority they do not possess, the line between religious zeal and fanaticism can vanish. And when that happens, the result is not Kiddush Hashem. It is precisely what the Torah seeks to avoid, a Hilul Hashem so profound that its consequences extend beyond a single person or community to affect an entire nation and the very image of the faith in the eyes of the world. The assassination of Yitzhak Rabin did not merely trigger a political crisis, nor was it solely a national tragedy. For many Jewish thinkers, that event became a decisive test for understanding the true meaning of the story of Pinhas. For suddenly, an ancient question stepped out of the pages of the Torah and into contemporary reality, a question that had been awaiting an answer for centuries. If Pinhas acted out of religious zeal, how do we distinguish between legitimate zeal and illegitimate fanaticism? The question seems simple, yet it is one of the most difficult any religious tradition can face. For the fanatic rarely views himself as a fanatic. He usually sees himself as a defender of the truth, as a protector of sacred values, as someone who takes action where others remain passive. And that is precisely why the problem is so complex. Both Pinhas and those who attempt to emulate him could claim to be defending something greater than themselves. So where does the difference lie? Following Rabin's assassination, much contemporary rabbinic thought re-examined the story of Pinhas with great care, and the prevailing conclusion was extraordinarily clear. Pinhas acted under unique and unrepeatable circumstances, unique in the history of Israel, unique in the context of biblical revelation, unique in their spiritual, historical, and legal conditions. Therefore, no one can proclaim themselves a new Pinhas. No one can look at a contemporary situation and say, now it falls to me to act as he did. For the very moment someone assumes that authority is precisely when the danger arises. And here we find one of the Talmud's most profound insights. Let us recall that seemingly strange phrase we studied earlier, halakha ve'ein morin ken. The law exists, but it is not taught. For centuries, many students wondered why the sages insisted so strongly on that warning. Why acknowledge a rule only to prevent it from becoming a model? Why keep it in the texts while simultaneously surrounding it with restrictions? After the Rabin case, many thinkers offered a resounding answer. Because the rabbis understood human nature. They knew there would always be people convinced that their interpretation was the only correct one. They knew individuals would always emerge who were persuaded they held a special mission. They knew there would always be those who confused conviction with authorization. That is why the Talmudic formula acts as a protective barrier. It is a warning sign placed next to a dangerous story. It is as if the sages were telling us, yes, this episode occurred. Yes, the Torah recounts it. But do not turn this exception into a license to act on your own. Many contemporary thinkers went so far as to formulate a provocative idea. Attempting to become Pinhas may be precisely the proof that one is not Pinhas, for true spiritual humility recognizes its own limits. It recognizes that authority does not stem from personal passion. It recognizes that truth requires institutions, procedures, and collective responsibility. And here, a lesson of great contemporary relevance emerges. The greatness of a religious tradition is not measured solely by the strength of its convictions. It is also measured by the mechanisms it develops to limit the power of those who believe they are acting in the name of those convictions. That is why the Rabin case became a test for the concept of *Hilul Hashem, because it forced contemporary Judaism to answer a question that remains relevant for all generations. It is not enough to ask who claims to be defending God. The truly important question is, who granted them the authority to do so? And the rabbinic answer was clear. In a tradition built upon law, debate, and communal responsibility, no one has the right to proclaim themselves a new Pinhas, precisely because the wise understood that the shortest path to fanaticism begins when a person ceases to recognize the limits of their own authority. And finally, we arrive at the deepest paradox of the entire concept of *Hilul Hashem, a paradox so unsettling, but it has accompanied Judaism for centuries. And it is this: a person can sincerely believe they are defending God while simultaneously profaning his name. Let us reflect on this for a moment. Most of history's great sinners knew they were doing something wrong. But the most dangerous acts often stem from a different source. They stem from people convinced they are doing good, people who believe they possess absolute truth, people who act not out of malice, but out of certainty. And that is precisely where the risk lies. For when someone stops questioning themselves, they begin to view any opposition as a threat. And when every disagreement is seen as a threat, violence can start to look like a virtue. Jewish tradition recognized this danger with extraordinary clarity. That is why the sages did not merely combat sin, they also sought to curb fanaticism. They understood that a society can recover from many errors, but it is far harder to recover from individuals convinced that their actions are sanctioned by God. For this reason, they developed safeguards. They limited religious zeal. They limited sacred violence. They limited vigilantism. They created courts. They established procedures. They fostered debate. They turned discussion into a spiritual virtue. Why? Because they understood something profoundly human. No one is entirely objective when judging their own convictions. We all need limits. We all need correction. We all need other voices to examine our certainties. And perhaps that is the most important lesson to emerge from the entire story of Pinhas. The true danger does not always come from those who defy God. Sometimes it comes from those absolutely convinced they are defending him. That is why Rabbinic Judaism placed intellectual humility above impulsiveness and deliberation above immediate reaction. For a mature faith does not fear asking questions. It does not fear accountability. It does not fear scrutiny. Ultimately, the greatest asterisk Hilul Hashem, desecration of God's name, does not consist solely of turning away from God. It can also consist of invoking his name to justify that which he never asked for. And that is perhaps the most profound warning this parasha offers us. Before asking ourselves whether we are defending God, we must ask ourselves whether our actions truly honor the values we claim to uphold. For not everything done in God's name sanctifies his name. And some of the greatest desecrations begin precisely when someone is convinced they are doing the right thing. And so we reach the end of our journey through one of the most complex, provocative, and challenging parasha in the entire Torah. If there is one thing we have discovered throughout this class, it is that the parasha of Pinhas is not simply the story of an act of violence rewarded by God. If it were merely that, the discussion would have ended long ago. But it did not end. For more than 3,000 years, rabbis, philosophers, Kabbalists, and scholars have kept returning to this text because it functions in reality as a genuine theological laboratory, a space where some of the most difficult questions of the religious experience are put to the test. What are the limits of spiritual zeal? Who has the authority to act in God's name? And when can the defense of the sacred end up destroying the very thing it seeks to protect? Classical Jewish tradition addresses these questions through a fascinating tension. On one hand, it maintains that Pinhas performed an act approved by God under absolutely exceptional circumstances. Yet at the same time, it insists that this act cannot be transformed into a general model for Jewish life. And although these two assertions seem contradictory, the wisdom of the tradition lies precisely in that contradiction. For the sages understood that an exception can be acknowledged without becoming a rule. They understood that an extraordinary episode must not supplant the enduring principles of justice, deliberation, and collective responsibility. That is why Rabbinic Judaism came to be built around courts, debate, study, and legal procedures, not around solitary heroes convinced they represent the divine will. Modern scholarship, for its part, has seen in this story a profound reflection on collective identity, religious authority, and political violence. But perhaps the most telling fact is that the questions raised by Pinhas never remained confined to the biblical world. They have resurfaced in contemporary history. The assassination of Yitzhak Rabin in 1995 demonstrated that these dilemmas remain very much alive. It demonstrated how a subjective appeal to divine honor can transform into a profound profanation of the name. And it reminded us that decisions made in God's name can have devastating human consequences. Perhaps that is why much of contemporary Jewish thought has reached a conclusion that is as profound as it is necessary. The true challenge regarding Hilul Hashem, the profanation of God's name, does not lie in identifying God's enemies. It lies in preventing those who believe they are serving God from ultimately harming the very values they claim to uphold. For holiness is not measured by the intensity of our convictions. It is measured by our capacity to preserve justice, human dignity, compassion, moral responsibility, and the humility required to acknowledge that no human being holds an absolute monopoly on the divine will. Perhaps that is the ultimate lesson of the story of Phineas. The most important question is not how much religious zeal a person possesses. The question is whether that zeal produces more truth or more destruction, more justice or more violence, more humanity or less humanity. For when the defense of God destroys human dignity, Jewish tradition invites us to suspect that something essential has been lost along the way. And there, precisely there, lies the true danger of Hilul Hashem. Not when we forget God's name, but when we invoke it without the wisdom, humility, and responsibility that his name demands. Thank you very much for watching. This is Abel Flores, founder of Mishnah TV. Please remember to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Give us a like, and visit our website, lawmishnah.com, where you will find a wealth of material on these topics, as well as our free course covering the entire Mishnah in your language. I'm also leaving a couple of videos here for you to continue studying with us. Shalom.